I got on here and I was talking about how the deficiency story sabotages relationships and methods and the path. So I want to talk a little bit more about this. As we work with people through the years, things start to become clearer, like they start coming into focus, and we can see things that we couldn't see like 5, 10 years ago. And this is one of the areas which we've really gotten clearer on, the sabotage. And it's the basic, if you can understand this basic understanding of how the deficiency story forms and reinforces itself, you may see that it's something that has to be, you have to contend with it for a number of reasons. When I think of the deficiency story, I think of people operating in the dark. It's like they don't quite have the insight fully what is running the show, as to what's running the show. And if until you have that insight, again, it can be like operating in the dark. For example, people come to me to work on relationships, not realizing that a lot of it is that their deficiency story is being triggered in the relationship. So if they don't have a way of naming that, then it's like operating in the dark, and conflict, disputes, inability to resolve issues, resentment building up, sabotage, basically, ends relationships quite often. Remember, because the deficiency story seeks to confirm itself. This is the basic understanding. If you don't have it, it can be really frustrating. The basic understanding is that if you believe in deficiency, if that's part of your identity, every relationship, but also every method and every teaching that you hear is potentially being heard through that filter, so that there's sabotage. This is where a lot of the frustration comes from in all of these areas. It's very common for me to work with a couple, for example, where one of the people believes that the other person doesn't hear them. I'm unheard or misunderstood. That's just one example. And where the frustration comes in is that that person continues to try to get the other person to hear them or listen to them. But that deficiency story, I'm unheard or I'm misunderstood, all that it really wants to do is seek to confirm itself. So when your partner doesn't hear you, it proves your identity on an unconscious level. So even though you're working to be heard on the surface, and you may even be talking to your partner about that, like you're not hearing me, misunderstanding me, you're missing the story, the deep deficiency story, that you're not heard or understood. And if you look back in your history, you'll see that that story has been operating, or a similar story. So if in your relationships you find yourself not good enough, that so you may try to work that out with your partner or your friends, like, as long as if she would do this, if she would do that, or not do this or not do that, it wouldn't make me feel so bad. So you get busy trying to fix the relationship instead of going straight to the source, which is the belief that there's something fundamentally wrong with you. Deficiency, lack. So it's the reason that I keep talking about it is because I can see people operating in the dark. And I don't mean that derogatorily. It's not like shame, shame. It's like, can we now see this now? Because once you see it, it changes everything. The boomerang is your best friend in this work. So your relationships, the ones that you have right now that are important, it's good to illuminate where the deficiency story is operating, because that's where you're going to find your sabotage. So if it's operating in your relationships, okay, so even though I've said it again, say it one more time so you can really see it. If I bring into a relationship a belief that I'm unlovable, if that's part of my identity, and in fact, those are usually the core aspect of our identity, it feels really true. Deficiency stories do. So I bring that into a relationship. I'm going to interpret the things that happen in that relationship unconsciously in a way that confirm that I'm unlovable. So it's like tying your hands behind your back and trying to have a relationship. That's not a great metaphor, but it's an impossible tug of war, really, because consciously you may want the thing to work out, like for your to have a good flow of communication, a good relationship, intimacy. You may really want that, and even say that to people, your friends or otherwise. But as long as that deficiency story is operating, you have to understand how it operates. Its operating system is in the relationship to interpret things that are happening in a way that confirms the pain of separation, the pain of deficiency. So I work with couples who they're trying to work each other out in the mind, right? So one believes in a deficiency story and the other believes in a deficiency story, and they're trying to work the other out in order to feel no longer deficient. So if he would change, then I wouldn't feel helpless, right? Or if she would just love me more, then I wouldn't feel unlovable. If he would just listen to me, then I wouldn't feel unheard all the time. Operating in the dark, because as long as you have that deficiency story, you're going to interpret, you're going to look for, even if you don't recognize it, you're going to look for evidence of the proof of that deficiency story. And this is why you have continuous conflict and non-resolution of issues in relationship, where you can feel increasingly isolated or not connected, because these two stories are working each other out. So when I'm working with couples, oftentimes I just have to get them to see that it's the story that I'm not heard, which needs to be deconstructed, because that story will always interpret circumstances as if people don't hear me. It has to, because it's in the business of survival. It just wants to survive. See that? So if I'm in a relationship with you, I'm going to look for evidence that you're not hearing me, because I already have pain around that story. So that pain, that trauma, that pain body is looking for more pain. So then it happens like clockwork, because I'm going to interpret something that you're doing as proving that I'm not good enough, right? So trying to have a harmonious relationship without working on the level of deficiency stories is incredibly difficult, because of this self-perpetuating survival mechanism and sabotage that goes with it. I'm going to get to how that affects the path, but through the years, we've been able to really hone in on this sabotage element and see it operating in different ways. And another way is that, again, I'm going to give you some inquiry here around this to spot whether you have a self-sabotaging deficiency story when it comes to doing this work, or non-duality. Generally, if you're sabotaging yourself, let's eliminate that and start to look at that more closely. But the basic mechanism to understand is that that's what's happening in all relationship. So anything that the mind can see as an other or an object to prove its identity, it will, including a relationship, but also a form of self-inquiry, a meditation practice, a mindfulness practice, a therapy, whatever practice or therapy that you use, that's an object. So that object can easily be used by the mind to reinforce deficiency. See that? In other words, when you pick the object up, the practice, you may have hope of getting clear or becoming enlightened or embodied or whatever. You may have that hope on the surface, but underneath, the story wants to survive. So it will easily use the form or the practice as a way that proves deficiency. Now, how do you know it's been happening? Look at your life. Have you tried many relationships and tried many practices, methods, where it's like they all seem to result in kind of failure? Like they seem to prove that you're not going to get it, or there's something wrong with you, or you can't do it right, or something like that, or that your suffering will not fall away. That's the story that comes to methods. And then so we're trying desperately to use these methods to wake up out of the story, but the method is actually helping to reinforce the story. Catch-22. It's a huge tug of war. And then even listening to pointers. So I just did a video just a second ago on pointing to awareness. But if the deficiency story hears the pointers, if that's the center of your identity, then as it hears those pointers, it's going to interpret it like, oh, I'm not there yet. It's going to interpret to reinforce deficiency. I'm not good enough. I'm not enough. I'm not awakened. I'm not as something as him or her. See that? The same thing is operating in all of those situations. The interpreting of circumstances that confirm identity, relationship, spiritual method, even pointers. If you're not clear on that piece of it, the story will just seek to confirm itself. Even if I point directly to awareness right now, or give you a really razor sharp inquiry, if your story is that inquiry won't work, your suffering won't go away, or you're powerless or something, chances are that's the result you'll get from it. You see that? So it's not even about skill a lot of the time. When people aren't able to go deep on their own, a lot of the time it's just sabotage. The deficiency story is using the method or the pointer or whatever to confirm that you're not there yet. Can you see now why I focus on deficiency stories so much? Because they're running everything. We could just say it's ego running everything, but to be more specific, it's that particular story of deficiency. So let me give you a few reverse inquiries to test out whether you have a self-sabotaging story that is in some way sabotaging your practice. This is a series of reverse inquiries. You just sit with your eyes closed, kind of feeling into your inner body, resting as awareness. All I want you to do is give yourself a yes or a no to this and write down anything where you see a block, anything where you see a self-sabotaging story come up. Write that down so that you know that you believe that. And then you'll have a list of the stories that are operating for you at the outset of doing inquiry. These things sabotage. So the first reverse inquiry is, the Kiloby inquiries will work for me, or these inquiries will work for me. Just sit and listen for the response. If you got a no, they won't work, or I doubt that they will work, that's a sabotaging story. Hear me out for a second. If we're really honest with each other, we have no idea whether KI will work. That's the truth, is that we don't know. So when the mind has already decided that it won't work, that story is doing inquiry. So if you have the story that these inquiries or any inquiries or practice won't work, come back to inquiry on that program, because that program will seek to confirm itself. And right now it'll do it with KI, but what happens is that the story sabotages the method or the teaching. Like, I can't get it, I'm not good enough, whatever. And then it just carries that story right over to the next method. So let's say you go to Byron Katie's work after this and you're very hopeful in the beginning, but then slowly the story seeks to confirm itself. So somewhere in that, your inquiries break down like they're doing here, and you can't go anywhere with it, or it feels like it's not going anywhere because your system already believes that it's not going to work. See that? So it's like a long string of casualties, these practices and these methods for people who have this story. You can look back and see that even though you thought something was going to work in the beginning, just like in a relationship, the sabotaging comes in and the story arises again. This will not work for me. And that story cannot inquire successfully, effectively. It simply cannot, because it's already decided that it won't work. Here's the next inquiry for you. My suffering will go away. My suffering will go away. The truth is, again, we don't know whether your suffering will go away. That's about the future. We have no clue about that. But there's a mind here that's already decided the future. Then that decision around the future, that my suffering will not go away, that program could be listening to these videos and doing this work or other work, in which case you're likely to get the same result, which is that your suffering will not go away, because that strengthens the identity of the deficiency story there. Here's another one. I can do inquiry on my own. So here it could be a matter of skill. Do you know the skills? In which case, doing it on your own might be difficult if you don't know the skills. But even if you have the skills, there could be the story running that you can't do it. You can't do it right. Or you can't do it on your own. So imagine then you spend weeks or months trying to do it on your own and it's not very successful. Chances are because you have a story already that decided you can't do it or you can't do it right. And so that story seeks to confirm itself. So guess what you get? A method that you can't do on your own or can't do right. Sabotage. Here's another one. I trust myself and my own experience. Forget that there's no self. This is for the ego. It's a question, like a thorn to remove a thorn. I trust myself and my own experience. If you get some sort of no with that, think about what that means in your life. It means that as of right now, you can't trust your own experience. So if you did inquiry in which your own experience would arise, you'd have difficulty trusting the process of that. What that does is it creates and reinforces dependency. So as long as you have that belief, it'll always be like, somebody else has to do it for me. So I need to be facilitated, or I need to come back to the teacher. They need to do it for me because of this particular story that you don't trust your own experience. So get busy on inquiry on that before you start going into a bunch of experience. So what I see people doing is that they're not dealing with the sabotaging stories in the beginning, and then they're trying to dive deep on somatic stuff like repression, trauma, shame, addiction, something, and it's not successful. And frustration comes in, and I get those emails. So this is my chance to talk to all of you that are struggling. Before you let go of this method, make sure that it's not a sabotaging story that's doing all of these methods. And here you have the chance to deconstruct that story. So if before you leave, wouldn't you be interested in deconstructing this story that's going to sabotage the next method? If we do that work here, you can do that here and then you can still leave, but chances are you won't want to leave when you're no longer sabotaging yourself. Remember yesterday I was talking about evidence of repression. Sabotage is like that too, in that it doesn't just show up like it's like repression. It doesn't just show up like, oh, here it is, like obvious and conscious. Repression is you have to look for evidence of it. How you talk about emotions, if you vilify certain emotions, is evidence of repression. Chronic pain could be evidence of repression, but you never really see the repression mechanism itself until you get skillful enough to conjure it up into awareness. The sabotage is like that also. You have to look for evidence of it. You may not see directly the story, I have to sabotage my life in order to continue to believe I'm deficient. That's never that conscious, really. It comes up in inquiry. There are specific inquiries that we do around sabotage. If you're interested in going deeper with this, follow me to the forum that we're creating, because that's where we're going to do our experiential work. But for now, really illuminate whether you have one of these stories. Write down exactly what it is you're believing, like my suffering won't go away. Specific. I've seen instances, this is true, where someone was working with chronic pain and they tried to go into anger repression because they have a sense that the chronic pain is linked to it. But they can't dig deep into that area, and it's a complete sort of failure for them, the repression inquiries, because they have a story already that says it won't work. See that? So what I say to them is, why get busy doing deep repression work or any kind of really skillful, penetrative inquiry if you have this story on the front end? Spend your time first just inquiring and dissolving away this story that says KI won't work, or nothing will work, or I don't want to be rid of my suffering, or I can't be rid of my suffering, those kinds of stories. You can take this very deep, very far, very broadly. Because if you look at work, for example, your work, if you just say something like, I'm going to be successful at work, or I'm going to get the job promotion, or anything else like that, notice the objections. It's the same kind of thing. You're illuminating some story that sabotages you even before you start. So, looking at your relationships, like finding the stories that you believe, especially if you have a story that this isn't going to work out, they don't really love me, that I'm not good enough, something like that. Chances are it could be a relationship that isn't going to work out. But are you going to let that happen based on a deficiency story that sabotages it? Find the different areas where the sabotage is happening, and then you'll see that if it's happening in one area, it's happening in other areas. That your mind has already sabotaged success, love, clarity in spiritual practice, or awakening embodiment. It's sabotaging all of that. And then when you see that, you can focus then on that. Because if you don't, that sabotage is going to continue in all those areas. More years of frustration coming. I mean, look at the area of happiness, for example, or enjoyment of life. There are people who believe they don't deserve that. They don't deserve to enjoy life. So before they even get a chance to experience joy or enjoyment of life, the mind says they don't deserve that or they can't have that. When you see it operating in one area, you'll see it in many areas. We spend a lot of time looking at deficiency stories here, and these deficiency stories are rather persistent. So it's not unusual for someone to be inquiring into a story like I'm not good enough, and they have to stay in that inquiry for a while because of the strength of that very powerful story in their life that they're completely identified with, and it's repeating persistently on some level. So that's where the rubber meets the road, doing that kind of work on that deficiency story. Because if you don't meet it like that continuously for a while, you don't see through it. It's too strong and persistent. So we're coaching people essentially to stay in inquiry around core stories because they're so sabotaging everything. It's good to spend time on that story. It's good to make a certain deficiency story your muse. Like for the next 2 or 3 weeks, all I'm going to do is look at the story that I'm unheard wherever it shows up. That kind of radical earnestness around it, like not just settling for the status quo and just continuing to believe this stuff, but bringing inquiry, bringing awareness to it whenever it shows up to see that it's not you. And this may take some skill because the persistence of the story Along with persistence is unconsciousness. So there's a great deal of the story that isn't even conscious until you can see it. So when people tap into this story, that's what they're going to see is like a bunch of different versions of that. I'm not good enough, or I'm not heard. Pictures and memories that seem to reinforce it. Even the pictures have words connected to them. Long string of these thoughts. And that's how it has to be in order for you to actually believe you're deficient. It has to have a lot of momentum to it. It has to have a lot of content or repeating content. Otherwise, it would be seen as illusory. If it didn't show up that way, you wouldn't believe in deficiency in the same way. But you believe in it because of its persistence and all the content that seems to prove it to you. So you have to be with the persistence and the content. How do you wake up from something that you turn away from? So here's the content persistently running. You do a little bit of inquiry on it, most of it remains unconscious. More sabotage. I find no other way to meet the deficiency story other than through repetition of bringing it up in awareness and seeing all of its elements and recognizing that's not you, letting each thing fall. There's an incredible peace in that, in taking inquiry that deeply, because the mechanism of comparing yourself to other people or even measuring where you are in time can fall away there. Because without the deficient self there, the deficient self, it exists through measuring and comparison. So you can't even have a deficient self without comparing it to another self. Like, I'm as good or not as good as him. That makes me feel real. Deficient. Comparison and measuring. So that's what we do on the path is we measure where we're at. We say, I'm right here, which is close to awakening. But there is no close to awakening. There's already awakeness here now with a story that you're close to awakening. That story rises and falls. That's the measuring mind. It tries to measure where you're at compared to where you should be. And that's always a feeling of deficiency. So don't follow the thoughts that say you're not there yet. See them, every single one of them. You can even say, I'm there, I'm here already, as a way to provoke them up. Watch every single thought. Don't fall for any of them that tell you that you're not there. Let each one be seen. That's the sabotaging of the path right there, is how the story comes up, even though there's a recognition like, oh, presence. That's what we're talking about. That's already here. The mind then starts measuring. It's like for a sense of self, like I am not here yet. I am almost there. See that thought? Or I have a long way to go. See that thought? So if you don't see these thoughts, they have the result of sabotaging. And what sabotaging looks like on the path is just constant non-attainment. Just constantly getting there, but not quite there. That's what sabotage looks like on the path. Because these stories are coming up that believing instead of noticing them. And in believing them and not seeing them, they seem to form a self here that's not here, not there yet. take the measuring out and the comparison out, and there's just this no self that living in time, no self comparing itself to others. You can't do that with the mind. You can't get there. You can only notice the mind that measures and compares. And then just rest as what's already clearly and obviously awake here. Rest as what's already here. Let that be your home. And from here, see every thought that tries to tell you you're not there. And if you're resting here with me, check into some of your assumptions still. Like, look out and see it. Is there still a sense that, is there sabotage still? In other words, is the deficiency story still here? Imagining that awakeness or attainment is out around the corner somewhere. Does that still feel true as you sit here? If it feels like you're still coming to it, or even if you have a long way to go, see that thought. Rest again. See, because just by putting up the idea that there's something that's going to happen in the future, just putting it up and really believing it mirrors back that there's a deficient self here. See that? So just watch that. What is the fact that there's a apparent awakening experience that hasn't happened yet, or something, some attainment that hasn't happened yet? Does that mean anything about who you are here now? Chances are, if you've got that, then you'll have the self. If you have the object, you'll have the self. The object of future attainment creates the sense of a self here that hasn't attained. So can you just let all that be the image or ever thought about attaining in the future? Just let it be seen. Do nothing with it. Letting it fall away. But if it mirrored back something like, oh, I'm still not here, I'm still not here yet, or not there yet, see those thoughts. They're all happening in the awareness that's already awake. Some comments here. See what y'all have to say. What still feels somewhat true is that I will completely free after I processed all trauma. And it's, yes, I get it. So there's a good example, Serena. Look at the vision of you. There may be some processing of trauma that happens. Like, we can acknowledge that that's what the embodiment is about. And processing trauma can help abide here as awareness more easily, effortlessly. But look at, Serena, the image of you having processed all your trauma. You finally have arrived at that place. What does that look like, feel like? See that in your consciousness. And then ask again, what deficiency story arises here? Because from there would be some sort of sabotage that puts your freedom out in the future. What's the story here? Just maybe a little bit more looking to do. The thing is you can still process trauma in these things even without believing in a self that lives in time. It's crazy. But the mind thinks that you have to have the self that lives in time in order to process things. But things get processed from awareness without any strong, without setting any strong goal or anything. It's not about future. Just looking here now, at being curious at what's being believed now. But go ahead and do that, Serena, and see what comes up. Yeah. And then just reverse that or watch that. So if you're resting as awareness now, if you can imagine, just for a moment, imagine living from this, from the recognition of what's already awake. So with that recognition, everything is different in a way. Because as you bring that into a relationship, now you're not trying to affirm or confirm a deficient self. So it's just presence, bringing the presence to the relationship. How transformative that would be to actually see yourself as that and the other as that. No more sabotage, no more deficiency, wholeness already. Each person already experiences the wholeness already from presence. So there's nothing to gain from the other in relationship. There's already wholeness. See, if you're coming from awareness, that's what it feels like. If you're coming from deficiency, it feels not like that. But just imagine for a moment relating to others from this, how that would be different. Because you're not looking to your mind for a sense of self, and you're not looking at the other person. You're not trying to work out the other person, just presence. And then if you bring presence to inquiry, instead of bringing deficiency stories that sabotage to these things, again, if you brought with the presence in a relationship, you're not going to be sabotaging it because your center of identity is not in the deficiency story, and that's the sabotager. So just the absence of the deficiency story, and believe me, they can fall away. There are people who say, well, I'm always going to have my deficiency story. Don't talk about things that you don't have experience on. They have fallen away for certain people. They do fall away. So no more sabotage in relationship. No more sabotage in spiritual practice. Because instead of a deficiency story doing these inquiries, they're coming from awareness. So the inquiries are not being used to reinforce deficiency. They're just an exploration and awareness now. See how that's important to bring awareness to, instead of the deficiency story, bring awareness to inquiry. Awareness is what is in relationship. And of course, awareness is what hears, or from awareness is where you hear these pointers to awareness. So then in that situation, there wouldn't be a deficiency story sabotaging. You would just hear the pointers directly to what you are. No sabotage. No future seeking, essentially. No sense that I'm not there yet. No sabotage. I am this is the realization. This is all there is the realization. So as I say that, look to see how does that mirror back something to you? If I say all there is this is it. Presence is already here. There's nothing to seek. If I say that, does that set up a deficiency story? Like he's saying all there is this, but I don't recognize it. See that thought? I don't recognize it. So the awareness that I'm pointing to is what's looking at that thought. That thought is not going to recognize what I'm talking about. It just appears and disappears. You, that which hears, that which is already awake, is what I'm pointing to. The direct experience of that. So it's interesting even how non-dual pointers can make us feel deficient. If we don't talk about deficiency stories, anything can. That's why I talk about them so much. Anything can. So a teaching, if I get up here and I just did that all the time, it makes it seem like there's somebody here who's realized something. That's how the ego consciousness interprets it. Even though I may be pointing to say there is no one here, there's just this awakeness. Everything already is. Even though I'm not saying it from a personal standpoint, I'm not saying I have recognized something. The deficiency story mind will interpret it that way and even turn those pointers into a way of making you feel less than, not there yet, not complete, not liberated, unenlightened, unawakened, something. Just the pointer itself. It's strange because the pointers are not designed for that. They're there to point you to see through that. But if you're listening from that, the pointers can reinforce deficiency. Anything can. So if I were to say, true embodiment is when all trauma is resolved and all shame is unearthed and all the conditioning that created suffering is uprooted and you're living in clarity, translucence, presence, simple love. Even though that's just a pointer, you can see how the mind would say, well, I'm not there yet. And makes an identity out of it right there. So just letting that thought be there that says, whatever he just talked about, I don't have that. Let that be seen. When you go to spiritual teachings now or practices, can you hear them from this place? Can you hear them to see whether any of them reinforce deficiency? So before you listen to the words of the teaching, just boomerang them back like, okay, does this mean something about me? Does this bring up a sense of deficiency, this pointer, this statement, this spiritual quote? Does that bring up a sense that I'm not there yet? Can you do inquiry on that before you even try to listen to the pointer? The inquiry on what that mirrors back. Because otherwise then you're interpreting the pointer in a way that reinforces it. See that? So go to these meetings and these methods. Listen to these pointings, but if you're not aware of how the deficiency story interprets, you may actually be reinforcing deficiency by continuing to go back, not knowing you're doing it. That's why I think there's so much seeking, is because the deficiency story isn't being seen, and so we project out towards others that they have it. Even if the teacher is very clear, we still project that out, which creates more seeking. It's all coming from the deficiency story, which is more than a story. You feel it in your body. It can sabotage recovery. For those of you in recovery, if you keep putting your spiritual awakening out in the future, like you're working towards it, and that you'll be fully recovered then, that mirrors back that there's something missing now, right? That you're not there yet. And so recovery can be a way of perpetuating deficiency, constantly seeking the end goal or some state where something happens, and that whole chase. Even being in rooms with other people who are recovering, he's got 20 years, she's got 15. What does that mirror back? I'm not good enough. I don't have the approval that I need here. Right? So then the deficiency story is in recovery. And yet the deficiency story is a driver towards addiction. So here you are believing that you're a deficiency story. Maybe the word addict is your identity, and that's you feel deficient. And so look at what that might do is sabotage your recovery. How would it do that? Because it seeks to confirm itself. So if the belief is like I'm an addict or there's something really wrong with me, one good way to prove that is to remain addicted and compulsive. Whether you spiral down or you just substitute with other drugs or alcohol, you see what happens. It's reinforcing. Using actually becomes a way of reinforcing the identity. All the while, consciously, you may say to yourself, I want to stay sober or I want to recover. But if there's a deficiency story running the recovery, then the deficiency story wants to confirm itself. Self-improvement is another area. Maybe you're not even interested in enlightenment or recovery, but you're in a game of self-improvement. And maybe you never examined this, but look at the ideal version of yourself that you may be chasing. Like what does he look like? What does it feel like to be him in the future where all my issues have been taken care of? But most important, what does it mirror back about who I am right now? I'm not good enough. So that story is, oh my God, that story is trying to improve itself. And even if you do get some improvement in the story still seeks to confirm itself. So in the end, you're going to be chasing self-improvement forever. It's a self-perpetuating cycle. I'm chasing some self in the future, which mirrors back that I'm deficient now, which then propels the search for the improvement in the future, which reinforces the self now loop. Can't get out of the loop from within it. Can't think yourself out of it. If you try to think yourself out of it, you think yourself right back into it because it seeks to confirm itself. Healing becomes difficult. If you have chronic pain or an illness and you're in the business of healing, trying to heal that, continuously putting that off into the future, some state later, even though it's nice to have hope, if the hope turns into this longing for some state that you haven't reached yet, that creates stress now. And stress makes chronic pain and illness worse. It also reinforces deficiency. So if I'm seeking some healed state in the future, that mirrors back that I'm sick now. And then that identity will seek to confirm itself. How does it do that with healing? By never getting to the healing. It's always out of reach. When I was working with my chronic pain, I was very aware of the tendency of this because you want to have hope when you're feeling that awful. You want to think of someday when you'll, but what it did is it created stress. So I had to deconstruct the story of coming to any healing at all. And then by deconstructing that, it's just presence. And with presence, I could go into deep inquiry on the actual things that make up the pain for the healing. But I couldn't do that if I was focused on the future healing, thinking about healing as a future game, or that I'm coming to it. All my focus goes to that, so that the awareness is not freed up to look here at what is the stress, what is the trauma, the repression that creates or is involved in that chronic pain or illness. Can you see yet why I say the deficiency story runs the show in all these areas? I don't see how you could sit through all this and still think that this isn't important to look at. Boomerang is your best friend, remember. So if nothing else, even if you're doubtful of what I'm saying, spend a few days where all you do is boomerang your triggers back. So anything in life that creates upset or suffering or longing or seeking, boomerang it back. What deficiency story does it bring up? What deficiency story does that bring up? How about here? And then you'll start to see how it's running your life. You don't have to believe me anymore. You can just see it then. And then that may be the doorway into inquiry once you really see it for yourself. Yeah, that's it. Take a good